The lecture hall was massive and filled with students from across the galaxy, and Kira Vasquez sat in the very last row where nobody would notice her. And she kept her head down and her datapad dimmed to the lowest setting because that was how she liked it, and that was how she had been taught to be. Around her sat the children of 100 different worlds, and they were beautiful and strange and powerful in their own ways, and the Veltari students glowed with soft bioluminescence from their crests, and the Kretheks clicked their mandibles as they chatted with each other, and the Silthani waved their 4 elegant arms as they discussed something she could not hear, and all of them belonged here at the Galactic Integration Academy, where the brightest minds of every species came to learn together. Kira was human, and she was one of only 12 humans at the entire academy, and sometimes she felt like a ghost walking through halls filled with creatures that could crush starships with their minds, or see through walls, or communicate through pure thought. And yet here she was just a small human girl who kept to herself and spoke only when spoken to, and never drew attention to herself. Her mother had taught her that, and her mother had been very clear about the rules. Stay small, and stay quiet, and stay unremarkable, and do not let them see what you really are, because they are not ready to know. So, Kira sat in the back row, and she took her notes, and she pretended to be ordinary, even though something deep inside her bones told her she was anything but ordinary. Professor Tolveth entered the room, and the chatter died down immediately because Professor Tolveth was ancient even by Meridian standards, and his body was made of living crystal that caught the light and scattered it into rainbows across the walls. And when he spoke, his voice resonated like bells ringing in a cathedral, and everyone listened when Professor Tolveth spoke. Today, we will examine a significant historical event, the professor announced, and his crystalline form pulsed with soft light. We will study the siege of Harvest Moon Station, which was the final confirmed battle of the Devour War before the enemy disappeared from the galaxy forever. Kira felt her heart skip a beat, and her hands went cold as she gripped her stylus so tight that her knuckles turned white. She knew about Harvest Moon, and she knew it very well. The Galactic Council has recently declassified combat recordings from this engagement. Professor Tolveth continued. These recordings represent the most complete documentation of human military tactics ever released to non-human researchers, and I believe you will find them most educational. A Veltari student in the second row raised a glowing tendril, and his name was Taris, and he had never once spoken to Kira in 3 semesters of shared classes, and he probably did not even know her name. Professor Taris said, I thought humans were primarily support personnel during the war, and that they handled logistics and medical duties and transport and other non-combat roles. Several other students nodded, because this was what everyone believed, and this was what the official histories seemed to suggest, and humans were generally seen as a helpful but unremarkable species that had joined the galactic community only a few generations ago. Professor Tolveth made a sound that might have been amusement. That is indeed a common belief, and one that humans themselves have done very little to correct. But I think today you will learn that the truth is somewhat different. He gestured with one crystalline limb, and the lights in the lecture hall began to dim. What you are about to see may disturb some of you, and I want you to remember that this is historical documentation, and that the events depicted occurred 15 standard years ago. The holoprojector in the center of the room hummed to life, and a 3-dimensional image began to form in the air above it, and Kira felt her stomach drop because she suddenly knew exactly what they were about to watch. The image showed Harvest Moon Station, or what remained of it, and the massive orbital platform hung in space like a wounded animal, and its hull was torn open in a dozen places, and darkness poured from the wounds like blood, and that darkness moved and writhed because it was not darkness at all but devourers. The devourers had been the nightmare of the galaxy for nearly a decade before the war ended, and they were Creatures of chitin and shadow and hunger, and they consumed everything they touched, and they had destroyed 17 star systems before the allied species finally united against them. And even then, the war had nearly been lost. Harvest Moon Station housed approximately 40,000 civilians when the Devourers attacked. Professor Tolveth narrated, evacuation procedures were initiated, but they were not fast enough, and when the enemy breached the outer hull, there were still 12,000 souls aboard the station. The recording shifted to interior cameras, and the quality was grainy because combat recordings always degraded in high radiation environments, but the images were clear enough to show the horror that unfolded, and civilians were running and screaming, and the Devourers poured through ruptured bulkheads like a tide of living nightmares, and they were fast, and they were hungry, and they killed everything. They caught several students made sounds of distress, and one Sylvani covered 2 of their eyes with their lower hands, and Kira just watched because she had seen this before, and she had watched it many times in the quiet darkness of her room, when she needed to remember why she trained so hard. Then the camera angle changed. A human woman stood at a junction corridor, and she had positioned herself directly between the evacuation route and the advancing swarm, and she wore combat armor that was scarred and dented from previous battles, and she had no helmet, and her dark hair was pulled back in a tight braid, and in her hands she held a weapon that most of the students did not recognize. Kira recognized it, and it was an M7 pulse rifle which had been 3 generations obsolete, even during the war, and it was a weapon that should not have been effective against Devourers, and yet the woman held it like she had been born with it in her hands. This footage shows an unidentified human soldier, Professor Tolveth said. Her service records from this engagement remain partially classified by human authorities, and we do not know her name or rank. But Kira knew her name, Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez. Her mother, Kira, watched the woman on the screen, and she saw the face she knew better than any other face in the universe, and she saw the determination in those dark eyes, and she saw the complete absence of fear, and she felt tears building behind her own eyes, but she would not let them fall because she would not draw attention to herself. What follows, Professor Tolveth said, and his voice had grown quiet, is the reason humanity was granted a permanent seat on the Galactic Defense Council. The Devourers came, and they came in hundreds, and they filled the corridor like a wave of death, and the human woman raised her rifle, and she opened fire, and she did not stop. The lecture hall had gone completely silent, and not a single student moved or spoke, or even seemed to breathe, and every eye was fixed on the holographic recording that played in the center of the room. And what they saw there changed everything. They thought they knew about humans. The woman in the recording moved like nothing they had ever seen before, and she fired her rifle in short, controlled bursts, and every burst found its target, and Devourers fell and died, but more kept coming, and the corridor filled with their bodies, and still she did not retreat, and still she did not run. Her rifle overheated, and she did not even pause, and she simply dropped it and drew a sidearm from her hip, and she kept firing, and her movements were fluid and precise, and she seemed to know where every enemy would be before they even arrived, and she danced through death like it was a song she had memorized long ago. The sidearm clicked empty, and she holstered it and drew a blade from her back. And it was a simple combat knife, and it should have been useless against creatures whose claws could tear through starship armor, and yet she used it to cut through them like they were made of paper, and she was everywhere at once and nowhere they could touch. A Krethak student made a clicking sound that did not translate, but Kira knew it was a sound of disbelief and wonder, and the big insectoid creature leaned forward in its seat, and its compound eyes were fixed on the small human woman who fought alone against an army. The blade broke against a Devourer's armored skull, and the woman did not slow down, and she used her hands and her feet and her elbows and her knees, and she became a weapon herself, and Devourers fell before her, and they could not touch her, and they could not stop her. 11 minutes, Professor Tolveth said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. She held that corridor alone for 11 minutes against a swarm that had previously overwhelmed entire battalions of armored soldiers from multiple species. 11 minutes did not sound like a long time, but Kira knew that in combat 11 minutes was an eternity, and 11 minutes was longer than most battles lasted, and 11 minutes was long. Enough for thousands of civilians to reach the escape pods and launch themselves to safety. The recording showed the moment reinforcements finally arrived, and a squad of mixed-species soldiers came running down an adjacent corridor, and they were armed with the best weapons the Alliance could provide, and they were ready to fight and die to stop the swarm. But there was nothing left to fight. The corridor was filled with devour corpses, and they were stacked 3 deep in places, and the smell must have been overwhelming. And the human woman stood in the middle of all that death, and she was covered in ichor and her own blood, and she was swaying on her feet, and she looked like she should have been dead 10 times over. But she was still standing. A medic rushed to her and tried to treat her wounds, and a woman pushed them away, and she pointed down the corridor, and she said something that the recording did not capture, and then she picked up a weapon from a fallen soldier, and she started walking toward the next junction, because there were still more enemies somewhere, and she would not stop until they were all dead. The Devourers did not retreat from that section of the station, Professor Tolveth said. They stopped advancing because there were none left alive to advance. The recording ended, and the lights slowly came back up, and for a long moment nobody spoke, and the silence was so complete that Kira could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then Taras the Velthari made a sound that his translator could not interpret, and several other students shifted in their seats, and the Krethaks had all gone very still, which Kira knew was their way of showing profound respect, and the Silthani were staring at the empty space where the recording had been with all 4 of their eyes wide. Open human physiology, Professor Tolveth continued, and his voice had regained some of its lecturing tone, includes a chemical response system that they call adrenaline, and when a human perceives extreme danger, their body floods with this chemical, and it allows them to perform far beyond their normal physical limits. He paused, and his crystalline body caught the light. Most species have similar emergency response systems, but in humans, this response is uniquely powerful and uniquely sustained, and a human in what they call a survival state can continue fighting long after their body should have shut down from pain and blood loss and exhaustion. A Velthari student raised a trembling tendril. Professor, how long can they maintain this state? That is an excellent question, and the honest answer is that we do not fully know, because humans keep pushing past every limit we have documented. Professor Tolveth replied, there are recorded instances of humans continuing to fight, with wounds that would instantly incapacitate any other known species, and there are cases of humans surviving injuries that our best medical science says should be 100% fatal. The human you just observed, he continued, sustained 17 significant wounds during those 11 minutes, including 3 that penetrated her abdominal cavity and 2 that damaged her left lung, and she continued fighting effectively throughout, and she survived, and she returned to active combat duty within 6 standard months. The lecture hall erupted in sounds of disbelief and shock, and Kira kept her head down and her face carefully blank, but inside she was remembering those 6 months, and she was remembering the hospital visits and the rehabilitation and the nights when her mother screamed in her sleep because the memories would not leave her alone. Elena Vasquez had survived because humans were built to survive, and because something in their ancient evolutionary history had forged them into creatures that simply refused to die. I must share something with you, Professor Tolveth said, and his voice had grown serious. What you just witnessed was not an anomaly, and it was not a unique event. He gestured, and a list of names appeared in the air. These are all documented engagements from the Devour War, where human soldiers performed similar feats, he said. The massacre at Viridian, and the last stand of the Prometheus, and the breaking of the siege at New Helsinki, and, he paused, the night of broken chains. A ripple of recognition went through the Silthani students because the night of broken chains was sacred to their people, and it was the night when the slave moons of the Dominion had been liberated, and 3 million Silthani had been freed from bondage. 200 humans, a Silthani student said, and her voice was shaking. We were told 200. Humans attacked the slave moons. That is correct. Professor Tolveth confirmed. 200 humans against a Dominion force of approximately 30,000, and the battle lasted 9 hours, and when it was over, every Dominion soldier was dead. And 147 humans were still standing. The Silthani student made a sound that might have been a sob, and every Silthani in the room had turned to look at the back row where Kira sat alone and small and quiet. They were looking at her like they had never seen her before, and in a way they had not. The questions started before the class was officially over, and Professor Tolveth tried to maintain order, but the students would not be contained because what they had just learned had shattered everything they believed about one of the galaxy's youngest spacefaring species. A Krethak student named Vorthik stood up, and his massive form towered over the other students, and he turned toward the back of the room, and his compound eyes fixed on Kira with an intensity that made her want to disappear. Human, he said, and his mandibles clicked with each word. We have been told that your species was a support race during the war, and we were told that you handled supplies and medicine and communications while the real warriors did the fighting. Kira said nothing because she did not know what to say. We were told lies. Vorthik continued, and there was something in his voice that might have been anger, or might have been something else entirely. Your species let us believe that you were weak and ordinary and unremarkable, and all this time you were hiding. More students turned to look at her, and Kira felt the weight of all those alien eyes pressing down on her, and she wanted to run, and she wanted to hide, and she wanted to be anywhere. But here in this room full of people who were finally seeing the truth. Perhaps we should continue this discussion in a more structured manner, Professor Tolveth suggested, but no one was listening to him anymore. Terrace the Velthari rose from his seat and walked up the steps toward Kira, and his bioluminescent crest was pulsing with colors she had never seen before, and when he stopped in front of her desk, she could feel the heat radiating from his body. You are human, he said, and it was not a question. Yes, the soldier in the first recording had the same family name as you. Kira felt her throat tighten. Yes, that was your mother. It was not a question, and Kira could not deny it because her face must have given everything away when she watched Elena Vasquez stand alone against the swarm. Yes, she whispered, that was my mother. The room went completely silent, and every student was staring at her now, and she felt naked and exposed, and she wished more than anything that she could turn back time and skip this class and never have to face this moment. You have been in our classes for 3 semesters, Terrace said slowly. You have sat in the back and spoken to no one, and you have kept your head down, and you have pretended to be ordinary. He leaned closer, and his crest flared bright. But you are the daughter of that woman, and you're not ordinary at all, and you have been hiding from us this whole time. I was not hiding, Kira said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. I was being careful. Careful about what? A Silthani student called out. Kira looked around the room at all the faces watching her, and she saw confusion and fear and anger and curiosity and something that might have been hope, and she realized that there was no going back now, and the truth was out, and she could either explain or she could run. She chose to explain. Do you know what my mother told me before I came to this academy? Kira said. And she stood up from her seat, and she faced the room full of alien students. She told me to be small and quiet and unremarkable, and she told me not to let anyone see what I really am. Why? Vorthak demanded. Why would she tell you to hide? Because she was afraid, Kira said simply. Not afraid for herself, because my mother has never been afraid for herself in her entire life, but afraid for me, and afraid for all of us, and afraid of what would happen if the galaxy learned what humans truly are. She stepped out from behind her desk and walked down the steps toward the center of the room, and every eye followed her. And she felt like she was walking to her own execution, but she kept moving because that was what her mother had taught her. Never stop moving, and never show fear, and never let them see you break. When humans first made contact with the galactic community, Kira said, we discovered something that terrified us, and we discovered that almost every powerful species in the galaxy had used their power to conquer and destroy and consume. She looked at the Krethak students. Your ancestors built an empire on the bones of a dozen weaker species. She looked at the Velthri. Your people burned 3 inhabited worlds to glass during the expansion wars. She looked at the Silthani. And your kind were slaves, because someone stronger decided to make you slaves. The room was very quiet now. Humans looked at the galaxy, and we saw what power does to people. Kira continued. We saw that the strong take from the weak, and that empires rise on mountains of corpses, and that fear and violence are the currencies of civilization. She stopped in the center of the room, and she stood beneath the holographic projector where her mother had fought and died and somehow survived. And we decided that we did not want to be another empire. But you could be, a Velthri student said, and there was fear in their voice. After what we just saw, you could conquer anyone. Yes, Kira admitted. We probably could. The fear in the room increased, and she could feel it like a physical pressure against her skin. But we chose not to, she said. We chose to be small and quiet and helpful, and we chose to take the support roles and let everyone believe we were just another mid-tier species trying to find our place until the war. Professor Tolvith said quietly. Kira nodded. Until the war, and until the Devourers started consuming everything, and until billions of innocent people were going to die. And then we had to choose between staying hidden and watching the galaxy burn, or revealing what we truly are. You chose to fight, Terra said. We chose to fight, Kira confirmed. And when the war was over, and the Devourers were gone, we went back to being unremarkable because that was what the galaxy needed from us. She looked around the room at all the alien faces. You were afraid of the Devourers, she said. You were afraid of the Dominion, and you were afraid of every empire that ever rose and fell in this galaxy. And we did not want you to be afraid of us too. Are you saying, Vorthak said slowly, that humans have been deliberately pretending to be weak so that we would not fear you? Yes. The word hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. That is insane. A Velthri student said. Kira smiled, and it was a small, sad smile that made her look much older than her years. That is human. The class had ended, but no one had left, and the students remained in their seats, and they watched. Kira with a mixture of emotions that she could not fully read, and Professor Tolvith stood to the side and observed with his ancient, crystalline eyes in the silence stretched out like a rubber band about to snap. Finally, Vorthik the Krethag spoke, and his voice was quieter than before, and the aggressive clicking of his mandibles had softened into something more thoughtful. I must ask you something human, and I want you to answer honestly. Kira met his compound eyes. I will try. Could you do what your mother did in that recording, and could you fight like that if you needed to? It was the question she had been dreading, and it was the question she knew would come eventually, and she had spent 3 semesters avoiding it, and now there was nowhere left to hide. She thought about lying, and she thought about deflecting, and she thought about all the ways she could answer without really answering. But then she remembered what her mother had always told her about truth. The truth is a weapon, and like all weapons, it should be used carefully. But when you choose to use it, you must use it fully or not at all. Yes, Kira, said. I could. The room seemed to hold its breath. My mother trained me from the time I could walk, Kira continued. She taught me how to fight with weapons and without weapons, and she taught me how to use my body as a tool of destruction, and she taught me how to survive things that should kill me. She held up her hands, and they were small hands with slender fingers, and they did not look dangerous at all. These hands have been trained to strike at vulnerable points on over 40 different species, she said. I know how to collapse a Kreth-Axe respiratory system with a single blow, and I know how to sever the neural tendrils that give a Vulthri their bioluminescent control, and I know exactly where to cut a Silthani to make them bleed. Out in seconds. The students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and some of them edged away from her without seeming to realize they were doing it. Every human child born since the war ended has received similar training, Kira said. It is mandatory in our education system, because my species believes that true peace can only exist when everyone is capable of violence, but chooses not to use it. That is a terrifying philosophy, Terra said, and his crest had dimmed to a pale, worried blue. No, Kira admitted, and that is exactly why we do not tell anyone about it. She walked back to her seat and sat down, and she felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness and the weight of secrets she had carried for so long was lifting from her shoulders. But what remained was a different kind of burden. Every day I come to this academy, she said, and I sit in classes with people who could not stop me if I decided to hurt them, and every day I choose not to. And every day I pretend to be ordinary, because that is the life I want. But you are not ordinary, a Silthani student said, and her voice was soft and wondering. You are a weapon wrapped in the skin of a girl. Kira smiled sadly. Every human is a weapon wrapped in skin, and that is our curse and our gift, and we have spent generations learning how to be more than just weapons. Professor Tolveth finally moved from his position at the side of the room, and his crystalline body caught the light as he approached the center, and his presence seemed to calm the anxious energy that had been building. I think, he said slowly, that we must consider what this revelation means for our understanding of galactic history. He gestured, and a timeline appeared in the air showing the major events of the past century. Humans made first contact 63 standard years ago, and they presented themselves as a peaceful species interested in trade and cultural exchange, and they asked for nothing except the opportunity to learn from older civilizations. The timeline highlighted various points. They took positions in logistics and medical services and diplomatic support, and they built a reputation as reliable and hardworking and friendly, and no one ever considered them a threat. He paused. And now we learn that during the worst war in galactic history, they were the decisive factor, and they were the blade that cut through the darkness, and they chose to let everyone else take the credit while they returned to being invisible. Why? Vorthake demanded. Why would anyone choose to give up glory and recognition? Kira answered before the professor could, because glory and recognition lead to fear, and fear leads to conflict, and conflict leads to war, and we have had enough of war. She stood up again, and there was something in her posture that made her seem larger than her small human frame. My species nearly destroyed itself before we ever reached the stars, she said. We fought wars over territory and resources and religion and ideology and skin color and 1,000 other things that did not matter, and we came so close to extinction that the memory of it is burned into our collective soul. Her voice grew stronger. When we finally united and reached for the stars, we swore that we would never be the cause of that kind of destruction again. And when we met the other species of the galaxy, we saw how easy it would be to fall back into old patterns, and we saw how power corrupts and how fear breeds hatred. She looked at each of them in turn. So we chose a different path, and we chose to be helpers instead of conquerors, and we chose to build instead of destroy, and we chose to hide our true nature so that no one would ever have a reason to fear us. But we fear you now, Terrace said quietly. Now that we know the truth, how can we not fear you? Kira walked toward him, and she stopped just a few feet away, and she was so much smaller than his glowing Velthory form, but somehow she seemed to fill the space between them. Do you remember last semester when you were sick with the Viridian flu? She asked. Terrace blinked in surprise. How do you know about that? I know, because I spent 3 nights in the medical wing, helping the nurses care for you, and I held your hand when the fever was at its worst, and you did not even know I was there because you were delirious. His crest flickered with confusion. I could have killed you 100 times during those 3 nights, Kira said gently. You were helpless and unconscious, and I was alone with you for hours at a time, and instead, I held your hand and I talked to you, and I helped bring your fever down. She reached out and touched his arm. That is what humans are, and we are not the violence we are capable of, but the choices we make every single day. And I choose to be kind, and I choose to be gentle, and I choose to help people even when no one is watching. That, Professor Tolveth said, is perhaps the most important lesson any of you will ever learn. 3 days passed after the revelation in the lecture hall, and word spread through the academy like fire through dry grass, and suddenly everyone knew about the human girl who had been hiding in plain sight, and everyone knew about the war recordings. And everyone knew that humanity was not what they had pretended to be. Kira walked through the corridors and felt the weight of every stare and every whisper and every conversation that stopped when she came near, and she kept her head up and her pace steady because that was what her mother had taught her, and showing weakness now would only make things worse. Some students avoided her completely, and they would cross to the other side of the hallway when they saw her coming, and they would not meet her eyes, and she understood their fear, even if it hurt her heart. But others reacted differently. A Silthani student named Yeltha approached her in the cafeteria, and the 4-armed being stood before Kira with tears streaming from all 4 of her eyes. My grandmother was on the slave moons, Yeltha said, and her voice trembled with emotion. She was there on the night of broken chains, and she told me stories about the humans who came for them. Kira did not know what to say. She said they appeared out of nowhere in the darkest hour of the night, and she said they moved like shadows and killed like demons, and she said that when the Dominion soldiers finally realized what was happening, it was already too late. Yeltha reached out with all 4 of her hands and took both of Kira's small human hands in hers. My grandmother said a human woman carried her out of the pits, where she had been imprisoned for 30 years, and she said the woman was bleeding from a dozen wounds. But she did not stop until every slave was free. I am glad your grandmother survived, Kira said softly. My grandmother named her first freeborn daughter after that human woman. Yeltha continued, and that daughter is my mother and my mother. Name me after the same woman. She squeezed Kira's hands. We have been saying human names in my family for 3 generations and honoring human heroes, and I never understood why until now. She bowed deeply in the Silthani fashion. Thank you, and thank your mother, and thank all of your people for what they did for mine. Kira felt tears building in her own eyes. We did what anyone would have done. No, Yeltha said firmly. You did what only humans could have done, and that is what makes you special. After the cafeteria, Kira had a message waiting for her and Professor Tolveth wanted to see her in his office, and she walked there with a knot of anxiety in her stomach because she did not know if she was in trouble or not. The professor's office was filled with crystalline formations that caught the light and scattered rainbows across every surface, and it was beautiful in a way that made Kira think of cathedrals and temples and sacred places. Please sit, Professor Tolveth said, and his voice was gentle. Kira sat. I want to tell you something that I have never told anyone, the professor said, and I hope you will understand why I am sharing this with you now. He moved closer, and his ancient form seemed to glow from within. I served in the war, he said. I was part of the Meridian Medical Corps because my people are poorly suited to combat, but we are excellent healers. Kira nodded and waited. I was stationed at Harvest Moon during the evacuation. Her breath caught in her throat. I was in the evacuation zone when the Devourers breached the outer hull, and I was helping civilians board escape pods when the creatures reached our section, and I thought I was going to die. He paused and his crystalline body pulsed with soft light. Then I heard gunfire from the junction corridor, and someone shouted for everyone to keep moving and to not look back, and I did not understand what was happening, but I followed orders. His form shifted and colors rippled through his crystal structure. I was one of the 4,600 beings who made it to the escape pods that day, and I was one of the 4,600 lives that your mother saved. Kira felt tears spilling down her cheeks, and she could not stop them. I never knew her name until 3 days ago when you revealed it in my classroom, and I never knew she had a daughter, but I have thought about her every single day for 15 years. He moved even closer, and if he had been human, Kira thought he might have embraced her. I watched you for 3 semesters, and I saw how you kept yourself small and quiet and unremarkable, and I thought perhaps you were ashamed of what your species had done during the war. I was never ashamed, Kira whispered. I understand that now, Professor Tolveth said. You were not hiding out of shame, and you were hiding out of love because you love this galaxy, and you love the people in it, and you did not want them to be afraid. He made a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. I have taught students from every species in the galaxy for over 300 years, and I have seen courage and brilliance and kindness in many forms, but what you showed in that classroom was something I have never seen before. What did I show? Kira asked. Restraint, the professor answered. Genuine, absolute restraint, and the willingness to be seen as less than you are so that others could feel safe, and that is the rarest quality in all the universe. He bowed to her, and it was a deep formal bow that Meridians reserved for those they held in highest esteem. Your mother saved my life with violence, he said, and you honor her legacy with gentleness, and I believe she would be proud of you beyond words. Kira walked back to her dormitory that evening as the station's artificial sunset painted the corridors in shades of gold and amber, and she thought about everything that had happened and everything that had changed. Other students nodded to hers. She passed, and some smiled and some bowed, and a few reached out to touch her arm in gestures of friendship and respect, and the fear she had seen in their eyes 3 days ago was slowly being replaced by something else. She was not ordinary anymore, and she could never pretend to be ordinary again. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the galaxy was finally ready to see what humans truly were. Not conquerors, and not monsters, and not weapons of destruction, but people who had learned through blood and fire and countless generations of suffering that true strength was not the ability to destroy. True strength was the ability to protect, and to nurture, and to love, and to choose kindness even when violence would be easier. Kira reached her room, and she sat by the window and watched the stars, and somewhere out there among those distant lights, her mother was still serving, and still fighting, and still protecting the galaxy from threats that most people would never know existed. She picked up her communicator and composed a message. Mom, I know you cannot answer right away, but I wanted you to know that something happened today, and everyone at the academy saw the war recordings, and they know the truth about us now. She paused and thought carefully about her next words. They were afraid at first, and some of them still are, but I think they are starting to understand. And I think maybe we do not have to hide anymore. She smiled at the stars. I am not ashamed of what we are. And I am not ashamed of what you did. And I hope one day you can meet my friends and see that the galaxy you fought to save is finally becoming the place you dreamed it could be. She sent the message, and then she sat in the darkness and waited for the dawn. And across the galaxy, in a place that did not exist on any official map, Elena Vasquez received a message from her daughter, and she read it 3 times, and then she smiled. The future was in good hands, and for the first time in 15 years, she allowed herself to believe that everything had been worth it.